Toki ya yanaleo. Miyan kekansan, miwile pana sona pitoki pona. Hey, my name is Greg D3. I want to give some cool knowledge about Toki Pona, which is directed primarily at beginners. People looking to get past the stage of, I know all the words, what do I do next? We're going to be talking about the idea of breaking down a concept into its component parts and expressing that in smaller words, in fewer words, not in fewer words, but in the more specific concepts provided by the Nimi-pu. To start off, we're going to be looking at the Nimi-ku-suli and breaking those down into, into just the Nimi-pu, expressing those just in the Nimi-pu. The goal here is to give you a reference point for what it looks like to express those words and to express other concepts in Toki Pona. And we'll go on from there. So, for starters, let's look at lanpan. So, notable properties of lanpan. It has some connotation of theft, which is expressed in the Nimi-ku-suli and in ku. It has catching. It talks about receiving and similar ideas within that, right? Not every version of lanpan has a negative connotation. Of course, there is something said for the fact that there is some negative connotation present. Now, in order to break this properly, especially into the Nimi-pu, we need to think about all these different ideas in terms of the Nimi-pu. What does it mean to take something, right? This can be considered, let's say, me. Let me write that further from the me. Kama yo e yo and go on from there. Nila yan liwile ala, right? The importance of lanpan here, in this particular use of it, is that another person doesn't want it. So if you wanted to express this in just the Nimi-pu, there you go. That's the first step you need to take. Recognizing that, yeah, there's a bit more context here than just the item is taken or received. The item was taken and somebody else did not want it to be taken, right? And you can go through a similar process for catching and for receiving an item, right? Of course, these require a little bit less effort put into expressing the concept. But if you're catching the item, say in the form of literally catching in your hand, in that case, you could say, mikamayo e io tan kon, for example, right? You receive it from the air. At any particular point, there may be some degree to which you care about expressing not just where you received it from, when you received it from. You care about every little piece of context, right? So if you lanpan, that's not the end of the statement, right? Let's see. We also have receiving, which is about as clearly as you can get to mi, kama, yo, right? It does express itself quite well. Let's see. So let's move from there to another Nimi-ku-suli. Let's look at yasima. So yasima is interesting because it has a couple different definitions that not everybody necessarily agrees on. It does, to some speakers, mean opposite. We are not going to be looking at that meaning. We're going to be looking at its meanings to say reflect. So, for example, you have an object, a mirror, and of course, the appearance of the object on the other side of the mirror. What if you took the time to, instead of saying Io li yasima, what we said, Io li kama tu tan supalukin. Literally, the thing has become doubled because of a visual piece of furniture, right? We can break down this idea of a reflection, and we can break down the idea of yasima into just the nimipu using sentences. So like I said, io li kama tu tan supalukin is an example of how you could do that. There are also specific kinds of reflections. For example, echoes, a yasima kalama, a sound reflection, right? We express that. We have our kalama now reflect off of some large object. In this case, we yell into the mountains and the sound comes back to us. But in this case, we're not looking at two of the same kalama at the same time, though it is a kind of reflection. In this case, we're now looking at the same sound a little bit later. So in this case, let's express the temporal aspect of it. Let's talk about the time it takes for that sound to come back. Sina toki tawa suli. You speak to a large hill, right? Here you go. Sina toki tawa suli la kalama toki li kama sin tawa sina. You can hear the sound of right. This is something that's very important when it comes to not just the nimiku suli, but all Toki Pona. It is possible to restate yourself using other words very frequently, and this ability to do so is absolutely critical to speaking Toki Pona effectively. This idea of breaking down a concept into its individual components and then explaining each of those. And this leads us to, I think, one of the most important lessons you get as a new speaker. Toki Pona's phrases aren't names, they're descriptions. And, of course, looking at it, that seems kind of obvious, right? If I have an ilo kalamasuli, it's not a thing called ilo kalamasuli, it is a tool of sound and being large. But if we have that, we know it's only a description of a whole bunch of different possible things. All right, so yasima is done. Let's step away from the nimikusuli for just a moment to explore the idea of there being many different ways to express a specific concept in Toki Pona. So let's say we have a tree, right? Now, trees come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Some are young, some are old, some have green leaves, some have very dark leaves, some their leaves are turning red down because of winter coming, right? But broadly speaking, tree, green leaves, darkly colored bark, and of course, we can, with no issue, describe this as just a kasi. No problem with that. But at the same time, being just a description, kasi can refer to any number of kasi. It could refer to a flower, grass ground, moss growing on a rock, anything in particular. There's nothing about kasi that tells you for certain you're talking about this tree, other than context, right? If you and your friend are sitting there and you pull out a tree and go, "Oh, look at kasi," you probably know what's going on. But if you wanted to describe a tree to somebody who can't hear or see anything you're talking about and all they have are your written words to go by, well, what then? How could we describe a tree? What properties does it have besides being a plant? Well, as I noted, it does have the green leaves. So we can say it is lasso. It has a dark bark, and that is Pimea. Excuse me. The leaves themselves are often referred to as lipu or luka, depending on who you're talking to. And so here we'll say that it has some lip properties. Ooh, let me write it further from the board. There we go. The body of the tree is hard. It's difficult to break into. So you might refer to the body of the tree as. And you can go even further than that. Of course, plenty of trees, if you were to cut open their trunk, you would find water inside, even if only a small amount. And so you could say it has properties of telo. In a similar vein, you can refer to the branches of the tree. You have lots of those. And so then you know your tree has palisa, right? And when it comes down to it, in Toki Pona, any one of the words that describe a specific object can become its head noun. Any of them. Now, that doesn't mean all of them are useful or all that good for describing the object, right? If I were to describe a tree as lipu, really? Certainly there is a sense in which a tree is lipu, but it's not very helpful to a listener. And so a lot of times when you are taking a concept and breaking it down into its component parts, you have to think as well about what things are the most reasonable to think about. What is the most useful to your listener? And so in this case, yeah, kasi is an appropriate head noun for our tree. And then we can use any of these concepts we came up with to continue describing that kasi, to continue explaining to our listener what it is, right? And this is just for describing the original tree, describing it in a phrase. So we could say, we can go on to say the specific way in which it is suli. And you would generally say something like, ona li suli tawasewi, as in, it is large in comparison to the sky, right? It is literally growing up toward the sky. You could also say, not that it is lipu, but that it has lipu, which can be more specific about the property of the tree, right? Ona li yo e lipu laso lon sewiona. It has, I'm going to use the word document as a generalization for lipu in English, but of course, they're leaves. It has green documents, blue-green documents on the top of it. Sewiona. And you can go from there, continuing to describe in sentences into paragraphs about how your tree looks and acts on a regular basis, right? You can go to great length to explain this. This, again, is the core of Toki Pona. It is what really makes Toki Pona tick. The fact that you can break down into all these little concepts, the different ways to describe a thing, all of those things can become the head noun of that thing. So, go to another example of something breakdown that I actually looked at with the Kamasona server only a couple of weeks ago. Let's say we have a computer terminal. Now, a computer terminal is an interesting case because it's not obviously any one thing when you're looking at it, right? It certainly has sitelen. There is text on it. It is certainly square in shape generally. There aren't very many windows on your computer that aren't square. It is a tool that you use for interacting with your computer. And so we can go about marking down all these different concepts, right? It is an io. We can say li yo e sitelen. Generally, computer terminals tend to be colored black. They can also be brightly colored. They can be white. And so in this case, you could specify whichever one is relevant. Since we're here on a blackboard, let's say Pimea, right? And of course, computer terminals in interacting with a computer can also do a lot of math. So another one of its properties could be none. But again, here we have a similar problem to the tree. When we looked at all the different head nouns that were potential, all the different ways you could describe the tree, we ran into the problem that, well, only really one of these is consistent and appropriate for describing the tree in the first place. And so here we have this group of properties of a computer terminal, and we ask ourselves, which of these is the best way to get across to our listener what this thing is? And then how can we do better, right? And of course, for this purpose, I would pick ILO, right? ILO gets across the idea that this is something usable, right? There is something about this that lets you perform an action that has some value to you, right? You can use this, sina ken kepiken ilo ni. Excuse me. And so going from there, think about this now. If I describe a computer terminal as just an ilo, what I've accomplished here is I've told you there exists a tool, ilo lilon. Maybe I can go further and explain that it's on your computer. And for this purpose, I'm not going to talk about a computer right now, but we can just say ilo sona, the most common way people do it. Excuse me. So we could say ilo lilon, ilo sona sina, right? There is a tool on your computer. But we haven't gone to the effort of describing what that tool does, how it's useful, or any of these other properties of it, right? So let's say we do that. Here I'm going to introduce a couple of properties that are not already specifically spoken about. But of course, you'll be able to see why I did so. It would just take a lot of time to actually enumerate every little detail of that terminal. But you certainly could give it enough time, right? That said, clear this. I'm going to redraw our terminal. We have our prompt there, of course. So as I said before, ilo, li, lon, ilo, sona, sina, sina, toki. Gracious. Writing is not coming across well. Here, I'm going to go ahead and express this in speech because it might be a little bit faster. Sina toki tawa ilo da, sina ken wawa e ilo sona. If you speak to this particular tool that we are describing, starting in this first sentence, you can make your computer powerful. You can do something with your computer. And of course, here's kind of the tree of concepts, as it were. We have this original ilo. Of course, I broke it down into speech, but we say we have this ilo on our ilo sona. If you talk to this ilo, you can wawa or ilo sona, right? And so now we have different components of this process we can look back at and explain further. What does it mean to wawa your ilo sona? Well, you could be writing a new program in your terminal in order to do something brand new, making a brand new tool. Sina palia ilo, pekan ilo ni, right? Or you could be using it to clean up. You could get rid of all the junk files in your system. Again, any particular way you choose to wawa your ilo, that works fine. But the core purpose here in thinking about this is that idea where as we continue describing a concept, we kind of make a tree of all these different connecting parts that describe the core of what we're talking about. If I just said there is a tool in your computer and left it at that, it wouldn't be very helpful. But I can spend the time to tell you what that tool does, how it works, how it looks, how it behaves in a specific context, what you can do with it, every little detail. All right. So see, I've got about 10 minutes left here. So we're going to go on to one of the nimiku lili, which is a bit easier to express. And that would be mayuna. Now, in spite of being nimiku lili, this one is in fairly popular use. There are plenty who say that's not very useful, and sure, there are ways to express this pretty quickly in just the nimipu, and that's fine. But before we even think to use this word, let's think about what it means, how it works. And a couple of words in the kind of semantic cloud that is mayuna would include old, ancient. Excuse me. So more broadly, from a distant time ago, right? All these different ways we can think about mayuna. And it often applies to people, cultures, objects. You can have artifacts from a long time ago, iyo mayuna. You can have people who are particularly old, yan mayuna, right? And here's the thing. Mayuna's core conceptual, well, its core concept is talking about things that are from a long time ago, right? And so mayuna is something like oop, if I can write, here we go. Ioli lon tempo suli. Ioli lon tempo suli. This thing has existed for a very large amount of time. And of course, there's more specific and maybe more effective ways to express that. For example, io li kamasin lon tempo weka, right? The thing came to exist, it arrived newly at a faraway time, tempo weka, more similar to this last definition that I provided out of the, again, semantic cloud that is mayuna, right? Something interesting about mayuna, though, is that the kinds of times it talks about for things being old tend to differ based on the thing being referred to. An iyo mayuna used to refer to an artifact doesn't really end up being the same kind of mayuna as a yan mayuna. The artifact could be as old as the person, but when you think of an artifact, you tend to think of something from hundreds of years ago, or even thousands. Whereas if you think of a yan mayuna, an old person, you think of somebody in their 60s, 70s, 80s, right? You think of somebody who is probably a great-grandparent, or at the very least at the age that they would be. And so these different ideas of how far away the time is can also be expressed through comparison. One example that I worked with not all too long ago was making a distinction between something that is ancient to people versus ancient to a civilization, right? It was a story that I actually provided for Kalamasin, thanks to Jan Pensa. The story, I originally introduced it as a Toki mayuna, but in reality, that phrase Toki mayuna on its own could easily be confused to mean something like old mythology. But in fact, the story was only from around early 1900s. And so really, it was mayuna tawayan taso, right? It was only really old to the people, not to the civilization. Anyway, that is a lot of the conceptual breakdown for mayuna. Of course, nothing in particular can be comprehensive here, but certainly we can come a long way in breaking down this idea and thinking deeply about what is possible with these different words. And that's something that I'll note real quick. Generally, if you come across any kind of nimi scene, not just the nimi kusuli, but any whatsoever, think to yourself, what is this trying to convey, and how can I express that in just the nimi pu? even once you've done so, you may still find the word useful to you. You may still find that you like the word. It feels good to you. It is Pona. But nonetheless, it is still a useful exercise to think about, well, what does this word mean? Break it down, express it in the Nimi Pu. All right, let's see. Give me just 1 second and clear this really quick. There we go. All right. This one, since I've only got a little bit of time left, is going to be very quick. But there's one in particular out of the Nimi Kusuli that I find to be kind of funny, and I think it was intended as a joke word. But there is kokosila, which of course is to speak a language other than Toki Pona in a Toki Pona only environment. And that's a lot of very specific concept for expressing, or rather for a singular word to express, right? And that's not foreign to Toki Pona. Of course, we have the famous Kietes and Takalu, and we have Pu and Ku, which all express specific concepts that are not as broad as most Nimi Pitoki Pona. However, kokosila is interesting because unlike the semantic space of Pu, which of course encompasses interacting with Toki Pona, the language of good, in any particular way, this one can be described very, very quickly. The most common use of kokosila, again, still joking of course, but it's fun to explore, is something like o kokosila ala, right? And funny enough, this is essentially a funny way of saying o Toki Pona, right? It's, again, a little bit jokey. And of course, it's not the only one of the Nimi Kusuli that are jokey. But this idea that is expressed by kokosila, you can use it in pretty simple ways in just the Nimi Pu. It's one of the few that can be expressed very simply in just the Nimi Pu. Not to say that every word is one way or another more appropriate than another, but certainly in this case, the expressive power of kokosila is kind of limited to this. Now, the idea of kokosila, you speak a language other than Toki Pona in a Toki Pona only environment, you end up with Sina Toki ante lon tomo, or not necessarily just a tomo, but it could be a kulupu, it could be a ma, where a particular Toki Pona is being spoken exclusively. P. Here, I'm going to sit Pona here. Toki Pona taso. There you go. Kokosila can be expressed very, very quickly. All right, so I've only got 2 minutes left here. We're going to go ahead and click the board one last time. And I'm going to go ahead and give my sales pitch of sorts. I don't know if you see me around the community or know of my involvement in the Toki Pona VR community, but I do lessons over there pretty much every Saturday, that at 2 p.m. Central Daylight Time. If you'd like to come along and see one of these lessons, but of course in a bit more time and with direct access to me so you can ask questions along the way, feel free. We'll be releasing the link to the VR server shortly after Suno Toki Pona, and I hope you'll come along. Thank you so much. I hope you learned something.